Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. We've reached almost the end of the year, and this would be probably our last episode of the Ideas Factory this year, and we shall see you next year. But on this episode, we would. It's a good time to look back and see how has the world changed in this year. I have with me Professor Harsh Pant, and Harsh, this year has been an year which the world has never seen before. It was different, and it was the drastic changes that the world witnessed due to COVID-19 pandemic was something that the world had never seen before. Many of the global trends became redundant. Some of the world shaping forces reached an expiry date. So if we look back and actually start by thinking, what kind of reset did COVID bring in the world order? Because a lot of countries were put under lockdown. Countries became more insular. We saw a resurgence of nationalism, which was already there, but it increased. The supply chains were disrupted. At the same time, there was also talk or the need of increased cooperation, focus on welfare states. So those kind of things came in as well. Society should be more libertarian. All those things came up. So what kind of reset do we see that COVID-19 brought in?
Thanks, Naghma. What a dramatic year it has been. I mean, if you just recall what kind of discussions we were having in January 2020, perhaps we don't even recognize those conversations today, given the spate of change that we have seen. The sheer scale and scope of change has been very dramatic. Change, of course, was happening in the global order, and this is not simply the end of 2020, but the end of a decade. We will be entering into a new decade in January, and I think in some ways the scale of change has only gotten faster, the scale and bigger. So when you look back and you try to ascertain what happened this year, it's mind-boggling in some ways just to wrap your heads around the scale of this change. But a lot of these trends were visible. Whether it was new powers rising, China becoming more aggressive, America looking more inwards, Europe dealing with its own internal crises, Indo-Pacific becoming a new reality. They were already there, but just the fact that COVID entered into the fray and changed the equations, accelerated those trends. And that, I think, has been the big story, that almost everything that we were discussing, perhaps at a theoretical level in January, became very real by the time April, May, June, July came. And as we are ending this year, it's very clear that that there have been this has been a serious inflection point, both for the global order and perhaps for Indian foreign policy and security policy in some ways. So I think the big reset has been in some ways that the world's eyes were open and they got a bit more clear-eyed about the China question. We were all grappling with this question, the rise of China, what it would mean for the global order. And this year it became very clear that what China's rise means for the global order and the kind of challenges it would pose for the so-called liberal world order, and the challenge it would pose for countries like India, who have equities everywhere at this point, and even in a stable relationship with China. How do you manage those relationships? So when you look at this big reset, the US-China Cold War became a reality. It started happening, and it had started happening under Trump administration. And by the time Mr. Trump is leaving, if you read the document that the State Department has come up with on China, the policy planning, Office of the Policy Planning, it's quite remarkable, almost reminiscent of George Kennan's essay on Soviet Union, and which laid the foundation for the containment strategy. One does not know whether it would, the same sentiment would survive in the Biden administration, but certainly there is a consensus across America today, bipartisan consensus. There is growing consensus in Europe that if you do not challenge China on some of the fundamental values and norms today, then tomorrow might be too late. So clearly that has been the big reset this year insofar as great power politics is concerned. As great power politics bounced back, we are staring at some of the fundamental questions about the global order, some of the fundamental questions about the consequences, and those countries that are somewhere in between that had that, countries like India that wanted to keep themselves aloof from great power competition are finding it's getting increasingly difficult not to make certain choices. Choices that we would not have wanted, say in January. By the end of the year, we are willing to make those choices. So I think in that sense, the big reset has been that great power politics is back, that China's rise is a reality which is influencing every single element of the global order, and the world is pushing back in some ways. And that, I think, will be the big story next year.
So to look out for China, and we've seen that China's rise was, do you think it was accelerated by the pandemic? Because we saw the pushback too, and we saw that China's engagement with the world totally changed. It was more muscular, more aggressive, not only economic. We saw a wider gap between the China tech and the US tech. We saw a pushback against Huawei, not only in US, but also in Europe. So the Cold War was in a way translated into a tech Cold War. We also saw an increased tech Cold War.
Yeah, I think that perhaps is the second element of this era. Perhaps that we talk of Cold War as if this Cold War is going to be very similar to the Cold War we saw in the past between former Soviet Union and the US. That clearly is not going to happen. We are going to see a new variant of this Cold War where trade and technology are going to be at the center of this geopolitical contestation. Because unlike in the past, where Soviet Union and the US were not actually trading with each other, they were insular blocs which were aloof from each other. China and the US actually are interdependent. They are each other's most important trading partners. Not only trading partners, but now American complaints about China stealing away the technology and how China has built its own technology regime is a reality. So in that sense, trade and technological debates are going to be at the center of this conversation, as we have already seen this year. Huawei and 5G, of course, represent one element of it, but there is a larger issue. How does the free world, as it is called, protect its equities in an environment where the fourth industrial revolution will be dominated by these emerging strategic technologies? Because technology today is not simply a matter of efficiency. It's a question of global balance of power. Whoever has the most efficient and effective technological momentum, that country, that block of nations would actually be leading the next stage of global politics. And I think that's why the contestation is so severe. That's why the backlash is so severe. And that's why China is determined to become self-reliant now from whatever technological dependence it may have had with the West in the past. And the West is equally pushing back and making sure that China does not gain any more leverage over the West as it had been doing over the past few years. So therefore, technology, trade are going to be the dominant conversations going forward. And for a country like India, again, these conversations are very important because we have benefited from an open, liberal global order. India's growth rates in the past, India's economic rise in the past owes a lot to the fact that India was part of this landscape. Now, as globalization becomes deglobalization, as protectionism increases, as nationalist forces rise, how will a country like India leverage that international environment to its advantage? I think that's a question that Indian policymakers are asking, and we are already seeing the results where Indian policymakers are looking to revamp their own domestic infrastructure. They are looking to become, again, more self-reliant, make in India, and Atmanirbhar Bharat are manifestations of that reality that cannot be wished away anymore, given how technology, how trade has become the central core of this conversation.
Like you said, Harsh, China's rise has been accelerated. Do you think it's also been accelerated by the vacuum in the world leadership that was there? Because we found during the pandemic that US was almost not there. Multilateralism also was questioned. Organizations like WHO, there were talks about reforms in the WHO. US decided to pull out of WHO. I mean, it may go back now that the regime is changing, but all these decisions also put a big question mark on multilateralism, on these bodies, and the leadership that was expected from the US was just not there during this pandemic.
Yes, I think leadership question perhaps becomes the most significant in these tumultuous times. And what the world found during the Cold War was, during the COVID-19 crisis, especially the early stages, that the world was left to its own devices, that there was no one, no country, no nation, no leader that was willing to look at the big picture and manage and and transcend sort of the questions which were emerging from the domestic landscape. Perhaps it was inevitable given the crisis, given the scale of the crisis, and given how sudden it was. But I think the challenge was twofold. One, you had a question about the source of the crisis, source of the virus, and China's lack of transparency, China's decision not to reveal the information at the right time, China's decision to manipulate WHO. I think all those became very apparent and very serious questions about, as you were talking in terms of multilateralism. But the US was equally, if you look at the Trump administration's initial impulses, they were all about hoarding, medicine. They were all about making sure that first he was, dismissive of the challenge, and then when he came to the challenge, he was not really on top of the crisis. And in some ways, it, if one has to look back. To American politics today, one would have, one would note that if it were not for coronavirus, perhaps Mr. Trump would have won these elections. The fact that his ability to administer, govern during this crisis was not seen as very viable in the long term. That became a rallying point for his critics and for a large part of the American population. But clearly, I think the challenge we have seen is that with China not interested in the extant international institutions, or interested more in manipulating them than in using them for the larger global, as a larger global good, and those who have created these institutions withdrawing from these institutions, that created this vacuum. So whether it was WHO, whether it was even WTO, for example, where we have seen almost America's withdrawal, we have not seen any specific attempt to revive WTO. The fact that UN Security Council did not discuss, could not come out with a statement on COVID-19, on G2, even G20 could not do that. I think all those issues are on the table still, and we have not yet resolved those issues. So going forward, the challenge for multilateralism is that in this world where great power contestation is rising, how do we create institutions that can rise to the challenge, that can rise above this great power contestation? And I'm afraid at this point, there is a lot of frustration, as I think Indian Prime Minister made it very clear during his remarks at the UN Summit, General Assembly, that India cannot wait forever. And we are looking, if reforms are not initiated in these organizations, then the credibility of these organizations goes down remarkably. And there is therefore the space for middle powers to create something, is there. But even those powers need some leadership from major powers. And I think that is what we do not have at the moment. And therefore, we enter into the domain of issue-based coalitions and interest-based coalitions that we are witnessing, minilaterals, plurilaterals that are now sprouting all around. But I think unless we have a consensus on the global, sort of at the global level on how to make multilateral institutions work, I'm afraid if there is another type of a crisis, another coronavirus-like crisis, we will be in the same situation, because we do not yet have found a way of moving forward on this question.
Yeah. Absolutely. And the changes that America saw, the US election, which again was one of the most remarkable in many ways. I mean, never before America had seen an election where the president refused to concede the way Mr. Trump did. And the entire election was talked about for reasons which were not really, I mean, it was made fun of. It was a talking point on Twitter, the way everything was happening on Twitter. So what did it really mean for America, and how was this year different from America? If we look at the last decade too, this election that took place was very different. And what do we make out of the changes that are going to take place now?
Yes, I think it was quite an election, and of course for the rest of the world quite entertaining what was happening. But I think it shows the challenges that American democracy faces today, where you have you have an American president. Of course, he's refusing to concede, though of course now it's clear that in January, Mr. Biden will take office of the president of the US. But his supporters refuse to believe, and his supporters believe that it has been stolen
Mm-hmm.
from Mr. Trump, and that's that's a great travesty, because that means that you will have an entire population, a substantive population, which will look at Mr. Biden suspiciously, and which will not have that faith in him as a leader. And that is terrible news for American democracy, which is already, the fault lines are already very clear, fault lines are very serious. And the fact that in some ways Mr. Trump and Trumpism will remain alive, because Mr. Trump will have a big megaphone. He will be all over the media. Over the next 4 years, he has made it very clear he wants to come back in 2024. There are no senior Republican leaders who seem willing to challenge him. So if he remains, and if his intention is that he will run again in 2024, and therefore he will start preparing the moment he's out of White Office to come back to White House, to come back to White House in 2024. That means that the whole energy of America will be consumed by this domestic spectacle, rather than fighting or taking on these enormous challenges that America faces, that world faces, where again, as we were discussing, we need American leadership. And that I think is going to be a huge challenge, both for the global order, for American politics, as well as for Mr. Biden's leadership. So clearly, Mr. Trump goes, but Trumpism is not has it remains,
Absolutely.
and that remains a very, very potent force in shaping not only domestic politics in America, but also the larger global order.
And that will remain a big challenge for the incoming president. Mr. Biden will have challenges on those front. And when we look back, Harsh, this year, how has it been for the Indo-Pacific? This concept has become more and more important. We've also seen Russia questioning this concept of the Indo-Pacific, but the acceptance of the Indo-Pacific has also increased. So how significant has this year been for the concept of Indo-Pacific?
I think, if in some ways this has been a year where one can say that it has been a year of the Indo-Pacific in some ways, because the idea of Indo-Pacific, whether you look at it as a strategy, whether it's a concept, whether it's a policy, across from Western Europe to ASEAN, we have seen acceptance of the idea of Indo-Pacific, the logic of Indo-Pacific, the fact that center of gravity of global politics and economics is moving to the Indo-Pacific, and the fact that Indo-Pacific is today the center of gravity of global opportunities and global challenges. I think that is well recognized. I don't think that there is any debate on that anymore. And in some ways, at the level of ideas, this has been a big defeat for China, because China consistently from the very beginning was dismissive of the idea, was trying its very best to make sure that other countries don't adopt it, and was openly pushing against the notion of Indo-Pacific. But the fact that today it is well accepted, the fact that it is today absorbed in national policy making, points in a different direction. But as you point out, there are still countries like Russia, for example, who have questioned Indo-Pacific, who continue to look at it as a concept which is largely about America and American desire to contain China. That I think will continue to be to shape the discourse on Indo-Pacific and over the next year and beyond. But my sense is that increasingly this will be irrelevant to the larger questions of the Indo-Pacific, because the larger questions of the Indo-Pacific are about what do we do about the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific? What do we do about creating institutional frameworks in the Indo-Pacific that can stand the test of time and the stresses that are available? What is the role that China will play? Will China, certainly you can, Indo-Pacific's rise has a lot to do with China. If China were a different country, perhaps Indo-Pacific would never have happened. The fact that Quad came out, and the countries from 2007 to 2017, to 2007, India and Australia were not very interested in Quad, but by the time you had 2017, again it renewed interest, because how China was treating these countries. And again, by 2020, we have seen almost a weaponization of the Quad, with Malabar exercises, Australia being invited to Malabar. So in the realm of Indo-Pacific, clearly we are looking at the challenges and the opportunities for both, China as well as other countries that want to push back. So the question now going forward is, how do we create an architecture that, as India and many other countries believe, can be possibly inclusive of China if China wants to be part of this discourse, and also create the kind of stability that would be in the interest of all countries in the region. But again, that's a tall order given where we are at the moment. But that's the hope, that's the aspiration.
Yeah. And lastly, Harsh, if we look back at this year, then we cannot not talk about India China, the face off in the Eastern Ladakh sector, the banning of multiple apps. We saw TikTok and Baidu and Weibo. So the relationship kept worsening and the face off continues, even though the talks have been going on. The India China relationship uh, was, I don't know if we can say that it was never worse than what it is today. So this would also be one of the things that 2020 will be remembered for. The India-China face-off continues a long, long time, many months, and the Eastern Ladakh sector, in spite of the talks, we're still there.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's, from India's point of view, that's a big story of the year, and I think this would be the year when the innocence on China Sino-Indian ties died, because clearly there is a realization that things will never be the same again. The inflection point, we have reached an inflection point with China. We are looking at a relationship that, even if the present crisis is resolved, uh, perhaps will find it so difficult to come back on track, and just get a semblance of normalcy in that relationship would be very difficult for both sides to attain. What has happened in some ways is that once you challenge the fundamental assumption of Sino-Indian relationship as it had been evolving over the last several decades, which was that let's keep the boundaries stable, and let's continue to talk about it, discuss it, but at the same time allow other aspects of the relationship to flourish, and we will not unilaterally challenge the status quo on the border. If you remove that, then I think the relationship becomes almost unviable. And that is what I think India is repeatedly telling China, that it is very important that this crisis gets resolved and gets resolved in a manner that takes us back to status quo ante. Because if that is not the case, then we will continue on the present trajectory, which is about, as you were mentioning, which is about challenging China not only militarily on whatever India's limitations be on the border, but also on trade, also on multilateral platforms, also on technology, also the whole argument which was that let's develop other aspects of the engagement, so that the fire or the strength of the boundary question becomes relatively limited. I think that assumption is no longer valid. And the fact that we have not had um, a great response from the Chinese side, I would say,
Yeah.
a response where China at least acknowledges that this is an important challenge. Perhaps puts India in a very difficult situation, because it means that India will continue to move forward along the same lines as it had been doing over the last few months, which is to challenge China. In fact, only this week, Ministry of Commerce has declared that they are looking at reducing dependence on China in multiple sectors. So India's response is across domains, uh, and it does not matter whether it pinches China or not. Because this is a question that is often asked. Because the reality is that it pinches India as well. But the fact that India is now willing to bear those costs is, I think, in itself a significant statement of intent, that we will bear those costs, but we have to stand up to the Chinese misadventure on the border, because otherwise, not only India's vital interests get affected, but also the larger trajectory of India's foreign policy gets affected in many ways. So for India, it's very, very important. And for India, therefore, as a response, it is very important to build relationships with other like-minded countries. And we have lived through an era where many in India have questioned the need for going very close to the Americans, and there have been questions about whether India should be investing so much in Quad. But the reality today is that if Chinese soldiers are sitting on the border, then the question of equidistance does not arise. The old idea of non-alignment does not arise. The issue is India needs partnerships, needs coalitions, needs engagement, substantive engagement with other countries that are like-minded. They will not fight our battles, but that gives India leverage in terms of what it can potentially do in a world that is being redefined by China's rise and China's aggressiveness. So I think that's a challenge for India going forward, and I don't think in 2021 it is going to go away.
All right. So thank you so much, Harsh, for that discussion. That was a nice summing up of the year gone by, and a year which was totally unprecedented in many, many ways. We will see you all in 2021, or hopefully on a more optimistic note. And so that's it from us for this year. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Naghma.
Thank you.